I look out, having never been to Australia, but I have an image of it, of being one of rugged individualism and also no nonsense. These are possible cliches that have gone with the same way as they met an average. I don't know. But it has been so surprising of all countries to see the kind of things that seem to have been happening, well, with civil liberties and the police or whatever in Australia. Now, did it surprise you at all? I mean, am I wrong to feel this? Or do you see that actually this is exactly the way Australia would deal with this?
It's possible to be surprised by some aspects of the Australian response, but not by very many of them. Australia is a very distinctive polity. It has a very unusual approach to politics and a very unusual approach to civil society and to governance. That doesn't mean that it's so weird that it's more like China than Britain. It is obviously more like Britain, and it's not just the English language. But it is a very unusual country, and to be fair, many Australians, even when they first go overseas, don't realise how different their country is until they've spent quite a bit of time overseas. I mean, I started to experience it as a teenager. I realised, actually, no, other countries are very different from Australia. They do things very, very differently. They value different things. I wrote a long piece at the end of 2020 for Standpoint magazine, which was both praising some Australian qualities, but also provide an attempt to provide a warning to people. And so I was saying to those Americans who want to copy Australia's gun laws, or to those British people who want to copy Australia's immigration policy, or to many countries all over the world that want to copy the Australian healthcare system, all of these things are good things. They have, the country is extremely well governed. And it's also a shock to the system if you've come out of a particular political tradition that says, for example, oh, you can't centrally plan an immigration policy. Well, Australia can and does and has done since 1991, and it's the most successful immigration policy in the world. So you can take your Hayek and his knowledge problem and you can stick it where the sun don't shine, to use an Australian expression. Yes, Australians are no nonsense. They will be like that. So it's a very unideological approach to governance, but it's not that third wayism of Tony Blair. It is just this brutal kind of pragmatism. The poet A.D. Hope described it as the people who live in Australia are the people who will inhabit the dying earth. They are the last people who will be alive, basically. Everyone else will have died, but the Australians will still be there because they're survivors.
Along with Cher, of course.
Okay, that's good. I'll pay that one. Okay. So these are good things. You can have that idea in your head if you're Joe Biden and you're horrified about school shooters, if you're Priti Patel and you're horrified about migrants coming across in the channel in small boats, or if you're horrified about both the NHS and the American healthcare system. You could look at the Aussie thing and say, these are good things to have, but there's a price to pay. If you want those good things, you may have to, and this is the warning I tried to sound in my Standpoint piece, which is available for free. You can just go on their website and search my name and you'll find the article. Yes. Yeah. It's called Emulate Australia, ? And you may have to give up things that you find in your own culture in order to do the things that Australia does that you find very precious. And I have tried to warn people, to get this across to people without criticising Australia's remarkable achievements, but also to point out to them that it is a very distinctive country with a very distinctive culture. And there are some things you would have to do, for example, the American electoral system would have to be completely replaced and rebuilt from the ground up, probably with Australian advisors, in order to reproduce some of the qualities that the likes of across the spectrum, everyone from, you had Barack Obama praising the healthcare system, you had Donald Trump praising the immigration system, you've got Joe Biden praising the gun laws. So, for example, in Australia, voting is compulsory. Civic education is compulsory. It uses compulsory preferential, what the Americans call instant runoff, and what here is called the alternative vote. But it's compulsory alternative vote. You have to number all the boxes. and everyone is compelled to the polls. If you don't go to the polls, you are fined. So it drags the Australian political system to the centre.
Yeah.
And I don't mean centre in the terms of boring centrist. I mean centre in that you cannot produce a situation where, for example, working class voters who are hostile to immigration, as we saw in the Brexit vote here, are just systematically ignored. Because if you do that in Australia, it will rip the base out from underneath of one of the major political parties. So that, in many respects, the Aussie system has roots in compulsory voting. Not only is it compulsory voting, redistribution, all the fights in America over redistricting, and you finish up with electoral systems that are sort of roughly shaped like a spiral or a banana to try and get all the Democrats in one seat and all the Republicans in another. And there's trade-offs between the two. Both parties are equally guilty of this. They're all impartially decided in Australia, basically by algorithm. And before every election, you finish up with the same number of people, and any kind of electoral apportionment is structured in such a way that it is impossible to favour one side or another. It's impossible to have a gerrymander at the federal level. It used to be possible at the state level. I experienced this growing up in Queensland, but it is no longer. You tell an American, by the way, all the horse trading over congressional districts, give it up. You have to give it up. All your voting laws that you have about, whether it's voter ID or getting people out to vote or so on and so forth, you have to give them all up. You have to have compulsory registration. The Electoral Commission comes around to Australian high schools and registers all the students when they're 16 and 17, so that as soon as they turn 18, they're flagged as a voter. So it involves thinking about politics, and that's just one tiny area. There are many, many other areas as well, and you notice it's based on compulsion. Australia doesn't have a pensions crisis. Nearly every other Western developed country does. It has a system known as superannuation. It has had it since 1991, compulsory saving for when you work.
Right.
But do you see the compulsion again? It's this, Australians work out a good way to do something, and they think, oh, everybody should have that, but people are too stupid to necessarily choose that, so we'll choose for them. So it's a form of forced choosing. This is profoundly, profoundly different from any other political tradition. And if you look at the Australian constitutional debates, which I acknowledge many Australians are not familiar with the 19th century constitutional debates, but lawyers typically are. I mean, I was taught them. You learn about them. You study constitutional law in Australia because it has a written, entrenched constitutional document like the Americans do, with no human rights in it. And there you go. The only state in Australia with entrenched human rights in a form that would make sense to either an American or to someone from the European Union with the ECHR is Victoria. And that has been the state with the worst human rights abuses, or the worst civil liberties abuses. I'll correct myself there, because human rights and civil liberties are in certain respects contraindicated. And I think that it is probably only possible to guarantee civil liberties. I'm not sure you can guarantee human rights. And I'm put in mind of some comments made by my jurisprudence tutor at Oxford. He was Professor John Gardner. And he said, universal health care is a good thing to have. Don't pretend that it's not. But also, is it a right? Are you elevating to the status of rights things that are simply good things to have? And that has been why you've had your human rights organisations basically looking everywhere and looking under their armpit and not doing anything in the face of, say, lockdowns. That's the most obvious thing.
I think that's fascinating. This compulsion culture sort of goes hand in hand with conformity, maybe, does it? In a way. I'm just wondering, because when you see, for example, and I know it's different to when you go to different territories in Australia, but when you see the way that the police have behaved, for example, and it seems to have public backing on the whole, does it not? I mean, despite the demonstration, is that an expression of what you're talking about?
Australian policing is distinctively authoritarian. The police in Australia are closer to the gendarmerie in France than they are to the Bobby on the beat here. I think that is an obvious thing to say, and I've attempted to explain this previously to other media outlets, and I shall try here. There has been a long history in Australia of very authoritarian policing, going back before Federation. Federation was when all the states joined together to become the one country in 1901, but before that there was the state of colony of Queensland, the colony of New South Wales, the colony of South Australia, and so on, and colony of Van Diemen's Land, which then became Tasmania, that kind of thing. There has been a long history of very authoritarian policing, and there were even things that you tend to associate with South America now, like really quite nasty conflicts between civil society and the police, and something that almost approached what we would consider to be a military coup. Yeah. If you look at what happened to Governor Bligh, yes, Bligh as in Mutiny on the Bounty. I'm not going to go into all the history here, but it's well worth doing. Just go to Wikipedia or something like that and look up what happened to Governor Bligh, and you will see the very famous picture of the New South Wales Court, because Governor Bligh hid under his bed in the Governor's mansion, being hauled out from under his bed by members of the New South Wales Court in an incident known as the Rum Rebellion, where rum had become a currency in the colony. So this very authoritarian policing has deep roots, and the funny line that is being used, misattributed to Clive James, he didn't actually say it, but it is generally acknowledged that Peter Ustinov said a version of it, but I have heard it ever since I was a little girl, is, from my dad, is always remember that Australians are not only the descendants of convicts, they're also the descendants of their jailers. So this long history of very authoritarian policing, and sometimes too, I experienced this as a girl growing up in Queensland, a very corrupt policing. Lots and lots of brown paper bags, lots and lots of money changing hands, and association and corruption in the context of prostitution and gambling. One of the reasons why Australia was one of the first countries in the world to go down the path of decriminalisation with prostitution was precisely to take it out of the hands of the police, because the police were as bent as bobby pins. And you can once again read it on the internet, but it goes back to the 70s and 80s. You can read the report of the Wood Royal Commission into the New South Wales Police Force, which was famously and notoriously described as a joke as the best police force that money could buy, because of this cultural tradition. Now, it is generally acknowledged that the most authoritarian police force in Australia now is Victoria Police. And it took over from the Queensland Police, who were cleaned up, less authoritarian now. And that is why the worst stuff you've seen in terms of reporting over here, and including the incident with the rubber bullets, has occurred in Victoria. In the context of the COVID pandemic, Victoria has also had the worst outcomes of any Australian state, and the longest lockdowns. It's so extreme that Victoria at one point had something like 230 odd days of continuous lockdown, while Queensland had 3 days in total. So there are huge variations between the individual states, because that's another thing. I don't know whether you have any American viewers. So Americans will get this better than British people who are unitary state. Australia is a federal system, and there is considerable divergence between the states. So you could have a state in Australia, South Australia was like this, for example, that was kind of like Florida, and nothing was locked down, and it was very liberal, and so on and so forth. And then you could have a state like Victoria, where the capital city, Melbourne, actually had the longest period of continuous lockdown in the developed world. And those states abut each other. Victoria and South Australia share a border. So it gives you an idea that within one country you can get this incredible divergence. But just for, if you're an American, imagine if Florida and California were next to each other rather than separated by a continent.